Hello there, welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 6, Episode 3, Only Rock and Roll Will Never Die, another double episode, written by David Chase and directed by William Wyatt. The episode begins with Rocky and Jim watching a news report about the grisly murder of a family. The news then moves to cover a court case between Diane Bjornstrom and musician Tim Ritchie. Ritchie is played by our first, and as far as I'm aware only, Sherlock connection, Christopher Tabori, as he would go on to play Sir Henry Baskerville in the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes TV movie The Hound of the Baskervilles, a review of which you can find on this very channel. The case involves Bjornstrom suing Ritchie for lost earnings while they were a couple, echoing the real-life case of Michelle Triola and Lee Marvin. Jim has been convinced to work for Ritchie on a missing persons case, and goes to meet the guy who convinced him, Eddie, played by a returning George Loros. Ritchie wants Jim to find his producer and friend Brian, who has disappeared, and also happens to be a heroin addict. Jim is largely annoyed by Ritchie and his entourage, but takes the case anyway, seemingly mostly as a favour for Eddie, meeting journalist Whitney Cox as he leaves.
I never would have thought you were a reporter unless somebody told me.
As Jim is searching Brian's house, someone hits him with a rock, knocking him out, and once he's recovered, he gets a tip-off to speak with another producer, but this also seems like a dead end. He does find a packet of Japanese cigarettes at both locations, though, which puts him onto the next big thing, Japanese country singer Chiyoko Takai. It's also revealed that Eddie is infatuated with Whitney Cox.
When she's around, you look like a dog just wandered onto the freeway.
You think she notices?
But this is another unusual opening for a show that constantly manages to not follow a formula, as we're introduced to a lot of characters all at once. And yet it's done in different ways that allow us to follow along with who's who. First, the news report, which at this point seems incidental, but gives us an introduction to his client, Ritchie. Then there's Jim's pal Eddie in his distinctive bowling shirt. Ritchie's peculiar friend and business manager, Ronnie Martz, and music journalist Whitney Cox, all defined by unique looks, personalities, and introductions. We then meet Takai and her manager Jerry Ito as Jim masquerades as Jimmy Joe Mika. It's another dead end though, as far as Brian's location goes, but it does give Jim another new name to track down, Bernie Selden. As Jim leaves, he's spotted by the intrepid Whitney Cox. Jim then checks in with Dennis, and as he suspected, Bernie Selden has quite a rap sheet, as well as a list of aliases, and he's mobbed up. Jim goes to Ritchie's court case to see if he knew about Brian's mob connections, and ends up getting fired.
You're finished. You're off this case.
Yeah, I know, and here's a copy of my bill for your file.
That evening, Eddie arrives drunk at Jim's trailer, having also been fired. As Jim takes Eddie to the bar to console him over his lost job and his lost love, having blown it with Whitney, someone takes pot shots at them both, winging them and killing Eddie's new car, bringing us to the end of part 1. This is an odd first part that seemingly goes nowhere for quite a long time. While we get the excellent character work we expect from a David Chase script, there's very little plot, and it all sort of fizzles out up until the shooting happens. Jim couldn't find Brian and was out of leads, and there's no real sense that anything particularly untoward is going on, other than Brian knowing a mobster. Even with so little happening, it still manages to be compelling because the characters are so interesting. Although it's a huge risk to make this a 2-part episode, as I'm not sure the cliffhanger is quite enough. It's not like this is the first time we've seen someone take a shot at Jim, and it ends with the shooter taking off, so that we're left with no peril, just the question of who did it. The start of part 2 gives us a little more to get into, as Jim is furious about the shooting and thinks Whitney is the one who told Selden he was being investigated.
Whitney? No, I never even discussed the case with her.
They go to Richie's to see if Eddie can get his job back, and Jim reads Richie the riot act.
You gonna clean it up, or are you just gonna let what happens happen?
Richie eventually reveals that the reason he wants to find Brian is because Richie's first record was bootlegged by someone who had access to the masters and suspected Brian, not knowing of the mob connection. It was a surprisingly common practice at this time for the mob to put out their own illegal bootlegs of hit singles by stealing or bribing someone for the masters, printing their own records in mob-controlled vinyl presses, then selling them through mob-run record shops. If the legitimate owners of the songs complained, they were intimidated into silence, which appears to be what's happening here. Jim also finds out that Eddie did tell Whitney about his investigation, so he confronts her and finds out it was her who beamed him with the rock, unintentionally, and unintentionally put Selden onto Jim. They get Dennis to confront Selden, who of course denies everything. And after this encounter, Jim assumes that Selden murdered Brian and tries to play Cupid between Eddie and Whitney.
He's really taken with you, you know.
He also thinks Brian might be buried in his own garden, so grabs a shovel. Sure enough, Brian's body turns up, and when Jim goes to see Richie to get paid, Richie's in an extremely melancholic mood, lamenting the loss of his oldest friend. This is a surprisingly long scene of emotional torment for Richie, and Tabori does an excellent job. It's certainly not a scene we would get in a regular length episode, and you can see David Chase really stretch his dialogue writing muscles, as Richie openly discusses how much Brian and rock music meant to him before he achieved success, and Brian fell to the needle. We then return to a similar scene to the one that opened the two-parter, with Rocky and Jim watching the news, discovering Richie was absent from his court case and that Dennis has nailed Selden on bootlegging charges. But Jim then has an epiphany, that maybe it wasn't Selden who killed Brian, as Brian was the one supplying him with the bootlegs. He thinks that it was actually Diane Bjornstrom's star witnesses who committed the murder, two French filmmakers, the Florio brothers. Brian would have known the Florios were perjuring themselves for a cut of Diane's settlement and could have blown her whole case. So they silenced him, and Whitney has also figured this out, so the Florios have to silence her next. Luckily, Jim and Eddie arrive in time to save her, but in the process of catching the Florios, Eddie gets shot again, and Jim's car gets smashed up again. This is a very different episode, even considering the huge variety of episodes we've had, in that it has all the elements of a Rockford Files case, but is much less about the case than the people involved. Brian's disappearance and murder is almost an afterthought, particularly in how the culprits are eventually revealed, almost in the epilogue. This doesn't make the episode bad, but it does make the investigation element a little lackluster. Where the episode succeeds is with the people, though, in what is the clearest blueprint for Chase's Sopranos. The plot is almost driven by the stealth story of Eddie's initial infatuation for Whitney, that quickly fades when they get together, as does any attraction Whitney had for Eddie. And the open and honest way they discuss their sexuality is surprisingly modern.
All night, sexually, it was just, it was nothing.
I don't know, afterwards, it just wasn't Tim.
It definitely feels like Chase wanted to tell that story above everything else, but couldn't think of a mystery that fitted it, so wove it into a story where they are side characters, and it almost works. There are some beautifully written scenes that go on much longer than a regular episode length would allow, that also explore more of each of the main characters, particularly Richie's final scene and the confrontation with Selden, that gives us the sense that this is more real than a typical episode. And it almost works. And the driving theme of the episode is making mistakes and being allowed to make mistakes. And it almost works. But none of it quite works. Not because this is not what we expected from the show, as the show has always been loose with delivering what we might expect. The narrative just doesn't quite flow as well as it should. The main reason for this is the court case, which doesn't really need to exist, other than to deliver a much weaker murder plot, and to fill a little time. That whole subplot feels pretty meaningless throughout, and so the reveal that the witnesses in that case are also the murderers in Jim's case, just so they can get some money out of the plaintiff, just feels tacked on. I don't really understand why Chase pursued this rather than the more interesting angle of the bootlegging mobster, which is given equal prominence. Having said all that, it's still a good episode that does something a little different, and Garner and Loris are having great fun together, on the same side for the first time. They really do make quite the double act. So this one is a 4 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.